News of a brutal murder is always shocking.
Cordon has gone up around the building. Police said their search was still going on.
He was maybe surprised at the amount of blood that produced.
We know that he's very manipulative and charming.
But when the crime is committed by a cop, it seems even more horrific.
Locals knew the couple had not been getting on, but no one expected anything as vicious as this.
Nobody wants to believe that police officers are criminals.
To die at the hands of the very people sworn to protect us is, for me, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This man has brought shame on the Met.
He's got a very warped moral compass and probably has some sort of power trip, a lust for power.
In his mind, he probably thought, well, I'm a police officer, so I will get away with it.
In this series, I'm going to unravel the outlandish plots, lies and deceit of officers who attempt to get away with murder. When Carl Bluestone joined colleagues for post-work drinks on the 28th of August 2001, fellow officers had no idea that by the end of that evening, Bluestone and most of his family would be dead. At 9 p.m. that evening, the next-door neighbour of Carl Bluestone heard a bang at their back door. It was Carl's 7-year-old daughter. She was in distress, and the police were called.
Officers were called and they entered the house and found a scene of carnage. Jill had been fatally injured in the kitchen area. One of the children was at the foot of the stairs. One was in a bedroom upstairs. And another child was in a bunk bed. One of the children had fortunately been able to get out of the house and alert a neighbour who phoned the police.
The first responders were confronted by a truly horrific scene and the bodies of 2 young children, one of whom was only 18 months old.
Harrowing is probably a good way of describing it, but I knew from the outset that this was going to be a major investigation.
When you're going into a bloody scene, so that's traumatic in itself, involves multiple casualties.
Yeah.
You're trying to work out who is alive, so can you save anybody? And you've got children involved. It's just overwhelming.
How did 31-year-old Jill Bluestone end up dead, along with her 2 youngest children? To help lead me through the investigation, I've brought together a crack team of experts who will help me unravel what happened in this case and how the killer cops' training enabled them to cover up their crimes. Former top anti-corruption cop Julie Mackay, Serena Simmons, a leading psychologist, and Met Detective Howard Groves, who helped solve over 50 murders. They are going to introduce me to some of the worst cases of killer coppers from around the world. Julie Mackay is a former detective superintendent that has spent a large part of her career dealing with bent coppers. And if anyone can help me understand how the mind of a bad apple works, it's her.
This is one of those horrific crimes that nobody wants to think happens in their street, and they were a normal family living in a normal street. So in the house is Jill and the 4 children, completely defenceless.
Jill was attacked in the kitchen with a hammer. A child was attacked at the foot of the stairs, and then 2 other children were attacked upstairs.
The Bluestones lived in the suburban town of Gravesend in Kent with their 4 children. My first impressions of this suburb where the murders happened is that it's quiet and family-friendly. With Jill's job as an accounts manager at Basildon Council almost 30 miles away, she was always busy.
To have a high-powered, high-pressured job as well, you need to be quite a strong person to be able to do that. She was described by her sister years later when we did a report on her, that she described her sister as a strong woman. She was not a wallflower, she's not a shrinking violet.
Local journalist Carl Eve can tell us a bit more about the place the Bluestones called home.
Bluestones were seen as a successful professional family. Jill was a high flyer in the council. She was effectively going places. She had a respected job. She was liked by council officers. Her boss, the chief executive, saw her as someone who was going to go much, much further and perhaps even become the chief executive of her own council one day. Carl was in the police, would have been respected by his colleagues. And in the street, they must have been seen as just a successful family. You know, 4 kids, personalised number plate on the car. They must have been looked at as people who were going places, who were doing well.
Jill had been married to her police officer husband for 7 years. How was Carl Bluestone seen amongst his peers as a police officer?
He had had a career in policing that was untainted and had served his community well and was well thought of where he was based down in Kent.
How could such a picturesque town with outwardly respectable, loving people such as the Bluestones become the setting for such barbaric murders? I've come to Gravesend myself to meet the senior investigating officer on the case, former Detective Superintendent Colin Murray.
What was Carl and his family like? How was he seen in the area?
Well, the neighbours thought they were a lovely family. Spoke to the children, knew Carl was in the police. He was friendly, Jill was friendly. Just an ordinary family living amongst, you know, nice people. It's quite a nice area up here.
And Carl himself, how was he seen amongst his friends in the police force?
Well, he was on what we call a tactical team, which was a group of police officers, mainly men, who would carry out various jobs like search warrants for people, you know, for other police officers, be deployed into high crime areas. And they had a camaraderie, a friendship and a sort of kinship amongst them, and they were all sort of pally and got on and banter and that sort of relationship, really.
So Carl was seen as a nice guy?
Yeah.
But on the night of the 28th of August 2001, Carl would inexplicably turn from a nice guy into a monster.
And the actual day it happened, he was in the pub having drinks.
Yeah, he'd finished work, he'd done a day shift that day, went to the local pub, then went home and had dinner. We know from the neighbours that he was watching telly, The Bill, the old police programme, and then the neighbour heard an argument develop. And next thing the neighbour knew was one of the surviving children came out of the house and was banging on the door, very distressed, saying, Daddy was attacking Mummy, and can you call the police?
On the 28th of August 2001, in a quiet suburb of Gravesend, Kent, Detective Superintendent Colin Murray's police team arrived at the home of one of their police colleagues to find Jill Bluestone murdered, along with 2 of her children, another severely injured, and the 4th in emotional distress.
I was on call at that time for major crime, and I received a telephone call that a police officer had killed a number of his family and had gone on the run.
As Colin raced to the scene of this active investigation, information was changing minute by minute.
One of the children escaped and knocked on the door and was telling the neighbours to phone the police. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. She'd heard, obviously, the row and the attack, and she saw her mum on the kitchen floor with blood. And as she later said, Daddy was hitting her. Oh. And he grabbed her. She banged her head against the floor, but fortunately she was able to wriggle free. And at that point, Jill had told her to run and get the police. So she was obviously still alive, but the attack obviously continued.
How old was the child?
She was about 6 years of age.
So you imagine how terrified that child must have been. It's horrendous.
The brutal and barbaric nature of this case is truly hard to comprehend. Former Met murder detective Howard Groves has agreed to help take me through the horrific details of what happened on that night. And it all started with PC Carl Bluestone arriving home from the pub and instigating an argument with his wife.
He said something to Jill along the lines of, "I've heard about you today." Not quite sure what that was about. And then an argument ensues. And then, following on from that, he attacks Jill downstairs, and I think she gets at least 10 blows to the head.
10 blows to the head?
Yes.
With what? Just his hands?
With a hammer.
With a hammer?
Yep. 10 blows to the head. He then attacks 2 of the children, and they get either 6 or 10 blows as well. So we're talking about 29 blows just to Jill and 2 of the children. That does not include the attacks that he also made on one of the other children who managed to survive.
It's just so hard to comprehend how you could even... It's just children.
Yeah.
Innocent children.
Yeah. Now, I've done 34 years, and that one still chokes me.
So how can a police officer, a family man, do something like this? Top psychologist Serena Simmons has dealt with murders before like Bluestone, but even for her, this was on another level.
It's an appalling case. He did use a hammer, which actually is very different to a lot of the other cases I've seen, where typically men will maybe set fire to something, or they will use suffocation, like carbon monoxide poisoning. So the fact that he used a hammer from a psychological point of view, there's something very telling about that. That, to me, says he was triggered. There's underlying anger there.
So what could have triggered Carl Bluestone to such an extent that he would murder his wife and children?
In the days leading up to the crime, was there any strange behaviour from Carl?
So we know that he did actually go just a couple of days beforehand and he bought some rope. And why did he do that? And what was he thinking of and what was going through his mind?
One of the assistants says something, asking what he's doing, what he's going to do with it. And he says, "I've got a heavy furniture to move, almost as heavy as myself."
At the family home, the first responders were faced with a murder scene of unimaginable brutality, but also a terrifying question. Where was Carl Bluestone? With his knowledge of specialist tactics and training, he could pose a genuine threat to investigators. Had he left the house and the area, or was he still inside, somewhere out of sight?
So as far as the first officers were in attendance, they'd have seen what was in the house, and Carl could have sprung from anywhere, could have attacked them. I mean, it would have been a very quick moving event, and obviously very distressing, but quite frightening, I would have thought, for the first officers. Then the neighbour told them that there was a noise from the garage, and that's when they went to the garage with torchlight and found Carl. He'd taken his own life.
Carl Bluestone used the rope he purchased just days earlier to hang himself in the garage of their family home.
So he didn't even have, pardon the expression, the balls to deal with the circumstances of what he did. He took the quick way out, which was to kill himself.
The sad fact is that because these men typically kill themselves, we can't ask them why. So a lot of research will actually kind of link it back to possessive nature, that power, that control. You know, if I can't live with this family, I'm going to take my life away. No one else is going to have my family when I go.
Without Bluestone's testimony, it would be left to the police to try and piece together what could have led up to his murderous rage.
What's interesting, though, is how do you investigate? You can see what's happened, and the person who's committed the crime is dead himself.
The danger for an investigating officer is to make assumptions. Now, as bizarre as it may sound, on the face of it, you've got a man who's gone and attacked his wife and children, killed them, and then hung himself. But actually, look at it another way. Could this man have returned home and found his wife and children, and then to have taken his own life through distress? Okay, right. And I know that's unlikely, but it's not closing your mind off, because otherwise you build evidence and look for evidence to support my theory or the hypothesis of what's taken place. Now, very quickly we established that it was exactly as it seemed. Carl had killed his wife and family, Jill, and then taken his life.
Jill Bluestone was 31. Their son Henry was just 3. And Chandler was only 18 months old. All bludgeoned to death by Carl with a claw hammer before he took his own life.
But who was Carl Bluestone? And how did his violent personality spiral into murdering his wife, Jill?
Carl and Jill's marriage wasn't a happy one. From what the reports that came out after her murder, that there had been previous incidents where police had been called to the house over issues of domestic violence.
There were lots of red flags that were flashing right from day one from when they got married. Within weeks of them getting married, he attacks his wife. She was about 5 months pregnant. The police are called, he's arrested, but she decides that she doesn't want to take the case any further. That is not uncommon with a lot of domestic violence cases. Victims sometimes have to make that decision whether they go forward with it or not. In this case, nothing happened.
I think there's always a difficulty when police are policing policemen. I don't know what an officer may have thought when he attended the domestic violence reports. Certainly, if that was me, I would be reporting to my supervisor that perhaps I couldn't deal with this, or shouldn't deal with it, or seek the assistance of that supervisor to deal with it, because the allegation can always be made, whether true or otherwise, that a serving police officer received preferential treatment.
For years, Carl Bluestone got away with domestic violence, as Jill dropped each complaint, allowing Carl to fall back on his outstanding police record and leaving nothing for superiors to pursue.
Well, this is again part of the facade of someone who is committing domestic violence behind the scenes. They know to be the nice guy out in public, but they're often going home and taking out any anger, any frustration out on their partner.
Is that quite common for people who are abusive to their partners? That they're in the outside world, they seem normal and nice people?
Oh, yeah, very much so. Often you'll get a victim cover up for the perpetrator, for the husband. You know, police would attend a domestic incident where the wife's bleeding and say, no, I fell down the stairs. Very often, abusers are seen as Mr. Nice Guy in the local community, somebody to be looked up to. And I think that adds to the shock and horror when the truth is revealed.
The fact that Bluestone was such a well-regarded copper and at the same time was someone who was clearly capable of such violence just adds to the trauma of this case for me. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. And for Jill, worse was to come.
The next occasion, he threatens her with a meat cleaver. He tries to rape her. She makes an allegation to police. And yet again, she decides, I'm not going to take it any further, so that's the end of the matter. So there's 2 no's thus far. Those lights are still flashing. The next occasion, which is weeks later, he's at home, there's a disturbance, she gets into the car to get away, he smashes the car window. Eventually, he ends up back in the house. He's throwing things about the room. His daughter gets hit in the face with an object. Police are called. He's arrested, and en route to the police station, for some reason, he takes a whole lot of tablets, and they have to rush him to the hospital to pump his stomach of what he's taken. The CPS then made a decision, after he's charged, that there's insufficient evidence for anything to happen.
How is this man in the police force looked at?
Well, to all intents and purposes, no one really had anything bad to say about him up until that point. But obviously, senior officers would have known, and some of his colleagues would have known what was happening, because he was being arrested on occasion. Police officers were turning up at the address. Those officers who would have turned up at the address would have known him because they would have been his colleagues in some shape or form.
When he got arrested, surely then his job would be in threats.
Well, yet again, innocent until proven guilty. And if there are occasions where she decided that she did not want to substantiate the allegation, he would say, I've not done anything, she doesn't want to take it any further. The police senior officers' hands to a degree are tied. And that was 20 years ago.
He was a man that, for whatever reason, resented his wife and would provoke arguments. And it was clear that Jill, in the days leading up to her murder, feared for her life. And I think she did report to somebody, not a police officer, but a friend, that she was really frightened of what Carl would do. And sadly, that came to fruition.
I just can't understand how no one saw this coming and why the alarm wasn't raised earlier. After the tragedy, a statement was read out in Parliament. 4 incidents of domestic violence perpetrated by Carl Bluestone were brought to the attention of Kent County Constabulary, and all were recorded. The alleged victim in each of these incidents was Jill Bluestone. In 2 of the incidents described above, reference was made to the Crown Prosecution Service, who decided to take no further action. No disciplinary action was undertaken in relation to any of the incidents.
This was a police officer who was supposed to uphold the law. So an inquiry was carried out by Kent Police to determine what could or should have been done in relation to him. But I mean, things are very difficult sometimes, especially then when it's within the family home.
It's now clear to me that behind the veneer of respectability provided by his uniform, Carl Bluestone had a track record of domestic violence. But to really get to grips of how a police officer and a family man could have carried out such a brutal, premeditated attack, I feel I need to better understand the relationship he had with his wife. On the 28th of August 2001, Carl Bluestone returned home from an evening drink with police colleagues and brutally murdered his wife Jill and 2 of their children before hanging himself in the garage of their family home.
I want to know what could have led a police officer to murder his wife and his 2 children and leave his other 2 children seriously injured.
To try and get inside the mind of this murderer and what caused him to turn on his own family, I've called in the experts. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Shoham Daz and forensic psychologist Dr. Roberta Babb.
When you look at somebody like Carl Bluestone, he has this fragile ego, he has a high degree of narcissism, and he has this huge sense of entitlement. And you've got to wonder where that comes from. It's usually due to childhood experiences. So, for example, if somebody is relentlessly bullied when they were younger, or if they had parents that didn't show them love, support, and attention.
But this person's also feeling incredibly vulnerable, insecure, and potentially inadequate. So the idea of murdering their partner is also a way for them to discharge these feelings that leave them feeling vulnerable and potentially exposed.
It was reported that Carl and Jill had problems from the very outset of their marriage. Problems associated with Jill's success as a working mother. Even with 4 children, Jill managed to carve out a successful career in Basildon Council.
I think Carl was quite jealous of Jill's success at work. He thought she was having an affair, accused her of having an affair, and would end up arguing with her about that. Now, Carl had engaged in affairs in the past, but it was a volatile relationship at times.
The ironic thing about all of that is he was actually blaming his wife, saying she was having an affair. So he was obviously trying to justify earlier on probably some of his actions. You know, you're having a relationship with someone at work, but in fact, he was having a relationship. And at one Christmas, Jill felt that he wasn't around them. He'd spent that Christmas with his girlfriend. So he had a wife and kids, and he goes off and spends his Christmas with someone else, and he's having a go at her about she having a relationship. So you kind of look at those things and think, what a pathetic individual.
The relationship between Carl and Jill continued to deteriorate, punctuated by incidents where Carl would physically lash out at Jill and then beg her for forgiveness, until things finally came to a head.
In June 2001, just literally a couple of months before the crime actually takes place, he strangles her to the point of unconsciousness. And there's recently been changes in domestic abuse law around strangulation becoming a specific offence. It seems to be quite common in coercive and controlling relationships that the offender strangles their partner, and quite often during sex as well. And they say it's a consensual aspect of sexual activity, when of course it's not.
Jill told a relative that moments before Carl strangled her, she had suggested they should get a divorce.
There was a discussion, and he uses words to the effect, divorce is not an option, death is the only way out.
The mindset of someone who would rather murder their partner than have them leave them is one that's characterised by anger, rage, and also a desire for control.
Jill decided it would be safer for her and the children to try and make the relationship work. For someone to be capable of murdering their entire family, it seems almost unbelievable for his police colleagues not to have spotted the signs. Either they chose to give him the benefit of the doubt, or Carl Bluestone was a master manipulator.
Reading reports after the case, a lot of his colleagues spoke highly of him. What was that? Was he two different people, one at work, one at home?
Yeah, I can understand those officers. I could easily be working somewhere. For instance, you're a police officer, you're a colleague of mine, and I know you will, and I know you stand for good, you're similar to me. You have morals, everything else. So unless I knew what was happening in your personal life, as far as I'm concerned, Will's a great geezer. He's a nice guy. So then hear what had happened, it's going to be a shock. You're going to be thinking, what? For days you may think, is this really the person I was around for months and weeks and years, and visit barbecues together, we'll go and watch football, whatever. So it's not uncommon for officers to make such things and say, yeah, he was a nice guy, he was a good police officer. But there'll be some who probably knew that there were issues at home, but probably never expected that he would have gone that far to commit such a callous and heinous crime.
This ability to mask the violent man he was at home also showed up in the investigation when police questioned his neighbours and close colleagues.
As far as Carl's concerned, any of his friends see any red flags?
Talking to police officers that he worked with after the event, said there was nothing. They said there was no warning signs, he wasn't distressed, he wasn't depressed. Colleagues spoke of him as being okay. They were obviously shocked about what had happened, but not one officer ever came to us and said, do you know what, I should have said something because of X, Y, and Z. Right. Perhaps they wouldn't have done if there was that indication, but we had nothing. So the picture we had was of a normal, average person going about his work, but for some reason, obviously, went and did what he did.
Despite the apparent lack of warning signs, something clearly wasn't right with Bluestone's mental health. He'd had affairs, had rocked up quite considerable financial debt, and he also had a child from a previous marriage to think about. To gain further insight into his state of mind, I've come to meet leading psychologist Serena Simmons.
Would you class him, from what you've read about him, as mentally unstable?
When we look at people's mental state, it's not explaining away why they did something. And yet I'm very mindful that the research tells us that often the men that do this, so this familicide, this annihilation of a family, often are suffering with some kind of mental health issues. They typically do show signs of depression, that psychological instability, irritability. So there's something going on there. It's not the excuse for what they've done, but it gives us more insight into kind of the why and their behaviour, essentially.
It's part of the reason why Carl was doing what he was doing for control. He's trying to control her.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very controlling personality. Often these men want to control everything about the familial situation, so finances, the children, and any threat to that being taken away from them causes that trigger. This is mine. That possessiveness kind of kicks in.
Is there a certain type of person that people like Carl prey on?
Jill's not uncommon, as you know, she was a good mother, and I think a lot of people who are attracted to someone in those early years sees the best in them. They're a different person to start with, but once they're embedded in that family unit, they've now got a family, you know, your world is tied up together. So it's really hard for her to sense a world outside of that, to want to pull herself away. And these men are very manipulative. So we don't know what was said behind the scenes, but he may well have been nice to her in between or kind of grooming her. So the idea then for her is, well, I'll stay because it could get better, or it might be better for the kids if I stay. So often it takes a lot, you know, it's brave to want to move and to leave that situation.
The arguments between the couple continued to rage until, on the 25th of August 2001, 3 days before their deaths, Jill told Carl she wanted out.
I think there were several attempts to reconcile the marriage, but towards the end, it was quite clear to Jill that she had no option but to leave the family home. It was up for sale. Previously, it had been up for sale, then taken down with an attempt to reconcile the marriage. Finally, I think there was a realisation that the marriage was finished and Jill was going to leave.
She says, look, I've had enough. I'm going to divorce you. Property's up for sale. I'm going to take my proportion of it, put it in my bank account. I'm going to take the kids and we're going to move to Basildon.
Carl Bluestone was a ticking time bomb, primed to explode. And it appears that Jill's decision to leave may have lit the fuse.
Carl Bluestone may have actually seen the idea of divorce as a reflection of his own inability to manage or control the situation. He may have seen it as a slight on his sense of masculinity and his potency, but also it could be something about his own sense of inadequacy or inability to fully provide and be there for his family.
Dealing with mentally disordered offenders, I sometimes see people who present with a range of mental issues. Sometimes it can be paranoia, it can be agitation, they might have relationship breakdowns. If it's caught early enough and if the individual is open to treatment, then there might be ways of helping him. So for example, if he was to have something like a mental illness, he could be treated with specific antipsychotic medication. If not, and his suspicions are based in reality, then there are other options. So for example, there could be family therapy or marriage counselling, or alternatively, there could be a healthy way to try and detach from that relationship. But Bluestone didn't do any of those things. He took matters into his own hands.
On the 28th of August 2001, Jill Bluestone had completed her workday at Basildon Council as normal. Her police officer husband, Carl Bluestone, had finished his shift at the local station.
So there was nothing unusual about him on that day. You know, he'd been out with his colleagues for a drink after work. He'd gone shopping on the way home. He's engaged with a neighbour and had a friendly chat. And then when he gets in, they're sat down watching the TV together. So if you were to ask the question, did he come home from work thinking, I'm really cross, irate, I've had a bad day, I'm now going to go and take it out on Jill and the children? Absolutely not. None of those indicators were present.
Just as the 4 children were going to bed, a heated argument broke out. An argument that seemingly triggered Carl into an uncontrollable rage, in which he bludgeoned his wife and his 2 young children to death.
When you look at the circumstances surrounding the murders committed by Carl Bluestone, this, in my view, was one of the worst cases that I've ever come across.
But could these murders have been prevented if Carl Bluestone had been charged and sent to prison for the domestic abuse he committed earlier in their relationship, first in 1994 and again in 1999?
If he'd have been charged, convicted and dismissed from Kent Police, would that have saved the life of Jill and the children? And I've never thought that a real possibility. If anything, it may have exacerbated the whole situation. I don't think even when he was arrested, if he'd have been charged, if the evidence was there, convicted and sacked from Kent Police, some people thought that could have prevented him from doing what he did. My thoughts on that were it might have prevented him doing it as a serving police officer, but I don't think it would have cured the problems within that marriage.
While friends and neighbours of the Bluestone family struggle to come to terms with the apparently senseless slaughter, a clearer picture is now emerging of the police officer's troubled domestic life. Kent Police have revealed that Carl Bluestone, pictured here with 18-month-old Chandler, one of the sons he killed, was arrested 2 years ago after an earlier violent dispute with his wife.
There is this, we'll just deal with it in the house. Rather than take that step of, no, let's be proactive rather than reactive. Let's really deal with him. Let's consider the risk. What is the risk element? What kind of risk assessment was done after his second arrest? Historically, the evidence shows that a woman can suffer domestic abuse and assault up to like 35 times before she will even phone the police. So for Jill or for somebody to have phoned the police led to Carl's first arrest. This doesn't come out of the blue. This would have been building for a period of time. 2 arrests means that this has continued. Home Office stats are 2 women every week in England and Wales are murdered by someone they love. And those figures have hardly changed in 30 years. So when a police officer is arrested twice for domestic violence, at what point does a senior officer go, right, we need to take action? Not because he's a police officer, but because there is an inevitability about this. Unless he changes radically, there's going to be another arrest. There's going to be another assault.
But in 2001, with Jill seemingly unwilling or unable to testify against her abusive husband, the police's hands were tied.
Bring that situation into the current day process. There may have been things that we as a service and perhaps other agencies could have helped Jill and the family. Nowadays, if we'd have charged him, we could have removed Jill and the family to a safe environment. And then you enter the sort of theatre, if you like, of what happens when he's released on bail, or what happens when he's released from any custodial sentence. But police service are better equipped now to deal with events like that than they were 21, 22 years ago.
But in a murder like this, which has become a national news story, it was difficult for the police force not to come under fire from those who thought more should have been done earlier. When Carl Bluestone had been arrested multiple times for domestic abuse.
How did it affect the police force?
Well, it shook Kent Police to its foundation. You've got a serving officer who's killed his wife, children. On the face of it, a normal, everyday cop who's done what he did. It did have an effect on policing. What was then called the Association of Chief Police Officers would have been briefed. The leading chief on domestic violence would have been made very aware of this. I know that our Chief Constable had questions from the Home Office, which had been directed from the then Home Secretary. It received national publicity because, fortunately, it is such a rare event for that to happen.
We're in a different place now with where victims don't press charges or don't want to. They call it evidence-led prosecutions. There is the joy of body-worn video. So as soon as an account is given, it's captured, isn't it, in a format that can be used even if that person doesn't want to go to court. Understanding of domestic abuse and accepting that police officers do it is widespread now. I think back then it was just brushed under the carpet, and was it just the stress of work? He didn't mean to do it. Lessons from this and just learning and understanding about domestic abuse, changes in legislation have all helped towards preventing this type of offence happening again, particularly when it involves a police officer.
Because Carl Bluestone took his own life, there would be no trial. But instead, the case was heard by an inquest.
On the 6th of November 2001, Kent coroner Roger Hatch recorded a verdict of suicide on Constable Carl Bluestone, an unlawful killing of his wife Jill and sons Henry, aged 3, and Chandler, who was only 18 months old.
The inquest sparked a local and national debate about domestic violence. And local journalist Carl Eve spoke candidly to one of Jill's council work colleagues.
I remember having a conversation, he's like, yeah, we'd see her come to work with bruises, Carl. And we kind of like didn't know how to approach it, didn't know what to say, so, you know, she would laugh it off and we just accepted it. Because no one wants to have to broach it. Is your husband beating you? Are you all right? And victims don't want to necessarily wash their dirty linen in public. And so she may have been holding back information for a variety of reasons. But certainly what followed that murder in Basildon, there was a lot more understanding about people do know. There are ways you can make them realise, look, you don't have to live like this. And the local refuge, Basildon Women's Aid, became pretty instrumental in the whole county for being able to educate people. They were accepted very soon afterwards to go into the council and train council officers and staff. This is what domestic violence is. This is how you can approach it. And a lot of that came off the back of the murder of Jill Bluestone, because there was that real understanding that actually we probably saw this coming. We just didn't know what to say, so we said nothing.
And although the UK justice system has moved forward to help victims of domestic abuse, there will always be more that we can do.
This is a crime we'll all struggle to comprehend. I mean, will we ever understand what drove Carl Bluestone to do what he did? Perhaps not. Maybe we should spend less time thinking about him and more about the family and friends left behind.